We all take risks every day, right? I
Yeah.
mean, from the smallest decisions like what to have for breakfast
Sure.
to the big life-changing ones, like career moves or investments
Mhm.
or even relationships.
Yeah, absolutely.
But when it comes to organizations, companies, governments, nonprofits,
Uh,
when they're trying to reach their goals, understanding risk, well, it's not just common sense.
it's the foundation of everything,
Yeah.
really.
And you can't build a solid foundation without first understanding what you're building on. So that brings us to today's deep dive.
Risk assessment.
Exactly. We're going to be taking a deep dive into this crucial first step of risk management.
Yep.
And to guide us on this journey, we'll be looking at an article titled Risk Assessment by Pritesh Biswas.
Oh, it's a great piece. It really lays out all the key concepts, in a really clear and concise way.
It really does. And that's our mission today, to unpack this article for you, our listener, to give you a clear understanding of what risk assessment is,
Why it matters.
how to approach it, the techniques involved.
Yeah, without making it too overwhelming.
Exactly.
Uh,
Because it can be a complex topic,
Yeah.
but we're here to break it down into manageable, bite-sized pieces.
absolutely.
So to start, let's get back to the basics. What exactly is risk assessment?
Well, you can think of risk assessment as the very first stage in the whole risk management process. Its main job is to first spot those potential problems that could impact an organization
Oh, okay.
or a project or a specific strategy.
So we're basically making a list of everything that could go wrong.
Well, not just a list. It's more than that.
Yeah.
It's about evaluating how likely each of those potential problems is to actually happen
Okay.
and how severe the consequences would be if they did happen.
So it's not just about what could happen, it's about figuring out what is likely to happen and how much it would hurt if it did.
Precisely. That's exactly it.
And the article really stresses the importance of this evaluation phase, this understanding of the potential impact.
Right, because that's what makes risk assessment so crucial, especially when you're planning strategy. By understanding the potential risks and challenges early on, organizations can make much smarter decisions, more informed decisions.
Right, so it's not just a separate exercise. It's really integrated into the strategy planning process itself.
It has to be. It's woven into the fabric of successful strategic thinking.
So where can these risks actually come from within an organization?
Yeah.
The article mentions several potential sources.
Yeah, it really can pop up anywhere. From company goals, are we setting realistic targets, to stakeholder needs? Are we meeting the expectations of our customers, our employees, our investors? Then there's our key operational processes.
The day-to-day stuff.
Exactly.
Hmm.
How efficient are they? Are there any weaknesses? And of course, the availability and security of critical resources.
So things like technology, finances, and people.
Yeah, all of that. Those are all potential sources of risk.
Okay, so we've identified these risks and rated them based on their likelihood and impact. Now what?
Now comes the crucial part. Turning that assessment into action
Yeah, the article makes a really important point about that. A risk assessment report sitting on a shelf
does absolutely nothing.
gathers dust, helps no one.
It's true. The value of risk assessment is in how it informs the decisions that follow
Wow.
and drives the creation of the right responses to those identified risks.
It's like diagnosing a problem. You have to figure out what's wrong before you can prescribe the right treatment.
Perfect analogy. It's the starting point, but definitely not the end of the journey.
Okay, I'm starting to get a clearer picture of how this all works. Now, the article talks about two types of risk: inherent risk and current risk.
Right.
What's the difference between those two?
So inherent risk is the level of risk that exists before you put any measures in place to control it.
So it's like the raw, untreated risk, the maximum possible danger.
Exactly. It's the risk in its purest form. Current risk, on the other hand, is the level of risk that's left after you've considered the controls that are already in place.
So current risk takes into account the safety measures that are already working.
Right, assuming they're working as intended.
Yeah, so it's like the after picture, the risk level with our safeguards doing their job.
Exactly.
Now, the article mentions that different professionals might focus on one type of risk over the other. Why is that?
Well, it depends on their role and their objectives. For example, internal auditors often prefer to assess inherent risk
Why is that?
because their job is to evaluate how well the organization's internal controls are actually working.
Hmm.
So by looking at the inherent risk and then comparing it to the current risk,
Yeah.
they can see how much risk those controls are actually reducing.
They can see the before and after picture, how much of a difference the controls are actually making.
Precisely. It shows them where the controls are working well and where they might need improvement.
It gives them a measure of the control's effectiveness.
Exactly. It helps them prioritize their work and focus on the areas where the controls are maybe not as strong as they could be.
But the article also mentions that figuring out inherent risk isn't always easy.
Right. It's not always straightforward because you have to imagine a scenario where no controls exist at all.
Yeah, it's hypothetical.
Which can be tough, especially for risks that have always been managed in some way.
Hmm.
It's like trying to imagine a world without, I don't know, traffic lights.
Yeah.
It's hard to picture because they've always been there.
Right.
But to understand the true value of traffic lights, you have to consider the risks of driving without them.
I see your point. So auditors are looking at the big picture, the inherent risks.
Right.
But what about someone like a safety specialist?
Well, a safety specialist is often focused on the here and now. Their concern is the immediate safety of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to focus on the current risk, the risk level, with the existing safety measures in place.
So they assume the controls are working, and they evaluate safety based on that assumption.
Precisely. The article uses the example of an X-ray machine.
Yeah.
A safety specialist would typically assume that the protective shielding around the machine is working properly.
Right. They're not going to start from scratch and imagine what would happen if there was no shielding at all.
Exactly. But an auditor would look at that shielding as a control, something that needs to be tested and verified.
To make sure it's actually doing its job.
Right. So you see, different perspectives on risk lead to different approaches,
Different focuses.
and both are valuable in their own way.
Absolutely. Okay, now the article talks about different approaches to planning a risk assessment, particularly who should be involved in the process.
Right. It's not just about what you assess, it's also about how you go about doing the assessment.
Yeah, who's at the table?
Exactly. And the article outlines two main approaches, top down and bottom up.
So top down, that's driven by the leadership.
Yeah. The board of directors, senior management, they're looking at the big picture.
The big strategic picture.
The organization-wide risks that could prevent the company from achieving its overall objectives.
So it's a bird's eye view,
That's a good way to put it. Then you have the bottom-up approach.
which is more granular, more from the ground level.
Yeah, you're getting input from staff, department managers, people who are closer to the day-to-day operations.
They're the ones in the trenches. They see the risks up close.
Exactly. They can provide a different perspective, a more detailed view of what's happening on the ground.
It seems like both of those approaches are important. You need both perspectives to get a complete picture.
You absolutely do. It's about getting a balanced view of the risks the organization faces. And the article highlights the crucial role of the CIO in shaping the organization's overall risk attitude.
So the CEO sets the tone from the top.
Exactly. Their communication, their priorities, their actions, they all send a strong signal to the rest of the organization about how seriously risk is taken.
But the article also mentions a potential blind spot with the CEO's focus.
Yeah, sometimes CEOs can be so focused on external risks.
Like competition, economic downturns, that kind of thing.
Right, the things that are outside their control, that they might overlook internal risks, the things that are happening within the organization.
Yeah.
Things like financial controls, cybersecurity, those kinds of things.
So even a top-down approach can miss some crucial details.
It's possible. That's why it's so important to have a balanced approach.
And the article also talks about how the planning process should fit the organization's culture.
Right. If a company relies heavily on formal written reports, a risk assessment presented in a similar format is more likely to be well received.
Than, say, a series of workshops or something more interactive.
Exactly. Different organizations have different ways of working.
And the article mentions the use of voting software in workshops. What's the point of that?
Well, it's a great way to get immediate, clear feedback from participants on how they perceive different risks.
So you can see if everyone's on the same page.
Right. And more importantly, it can highlight areas where there's a significant difference of opinion.
Which could be a red flag.
Exactly. If people are seeing the same risk in very different ways, that's something that needs to be explored further.
It could mean there's a lack of shared understanding or a fundamental disagreement about the potential impact of a risk.
Absolutely. So it's not just about getting a quick vote. It's about using that data to identify areas where there needs to be more discussion, more clarification.
And most organizations, the article suggests, find that the best approach is to combine both top-down and bottom-up methods.
That's right. It's about getting the best of both worlds.
The big picture strategic view from the leadership
Right.
and the detailed operational insights from those who are closer to the action.
Yeah, it's a powerful combination.
And the article breaks down the typical focus areas for each approach.
Right. So top-down typically looks at strategy, tactics, operations, and compliance, while bottom-up often delves into compliance at a more granular level, as well as specific hazards, controls, and opportunities.
But it does caution that a purely bottom-up approach can be quite time-consuming.
Yeah, it's true. It takes time to coordinate all those input sessions and gather all that data from across the organization.
So it's a balancing act between getting a comprehensive picture and being efficient with time and resources.
Exactly. And in the end, the best risk assessment approach is the one that best supports the organization's goals and aligns with its culture.
While incorporating input from both leadership and employees.
Absolutely. It's a collaborative effort.
All right, we've defined risk assessment, looked at different planning approaches. Now let's dig into the pros and cons of top-down and bottom-up methods.
Sure. So starting with top-down, one big advantage is that it gives you that broad, business-wide perspective on risk. The key risks identified at the senior level are likely to have implications across the entire organization.
It's seeing the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And it allows you to quickly identify those major strategic risks.
The ones that could really sink the ship.
Yeah, the existential threats. And because it's driven from the top, it often helps to create a culture where risk management is taken seriously.
Everyone's on board.
Right. It becomes embedded in the way the organization operates.
And it leads to more consistent risk management practices throughout the company.
Exactly.
Sounds like a lot of advantages. But what about the downsides?
Well, one potential downside is that senior managers might be too focused on those external risks.
The things they can't control.
Right. The competition, the market forces, the regulatory landscape. And they might not be as aware of the internal risks or how different risks within the business might be interconnected.
So they might miss those crucial internal vulnerabilities.
It's possible. And there's also the risk that their view could be a bit too high level, too superficial.
They might be overconfident in their ability to handle a crisis when it arises, rather than proactively identifying and managing the risks.
That's a risk. And it could lead to new operational risks being overlooked.
So they miss the details, the things happening on the ground.
It can happen.
All right, let's look at the bottom-up approach. What are its strengths?
Well, a big advantage here is that you're likely to get broader buy-in across the organization.
Because more people are involved in the process.
Exactly. When employees at various levels are involved in identifying and assessing risks, they're more likely to take ownership of the process and support the resulting risk management strategies.
It's empowering.
It is, and it aligns well with the existing organizational structure.
So it feels more natural, more organic.
Exactly. And importantly, it allows for discussions about risks that go beyond just the daily routine.
You get a deeper understanding of the underlying issues.
Exactly. And operational staff, the people who are closest to the work,
Yeah.
they often have a very detailed understanding of those local risks and their root causes.
Insights that senior management might miss.
Right. They see things that others might not.
It's valuable knowledge.
It is. And another advantage is that the methods used can be tailored to fit the specific local practices and the culture in different departments.
So it's flexible.
It is, which is especially important for large, complex organizations, maybe with operations in different countries.
Global companies.
Right, where a one-size-fits-all approach to risk management just wouldn't work.
But every approach has its drawbacks. What are the downsides of bottom-up?
Well, one key disadvantage is that it might not adequately address those external or strategic risks.
The big picture risks that top-down is good at catching.
Right, the focus tends to be more internal, more operational.
So you might miss the forest for the trees.
Exactly. And it can be time-consuming, as we mentioned earlier.
Gathering all that input takes time.
It does. And there's a risk that it could become too granular, too focused on individual departments or processes.
So you lose sight of the interconnectedness of risks, how one risk in one area might trigger a cascade of problems in other areas.
That's right. And there's always the risk that new risks arising from day-to-day operations might still go unreported.
If staff don't recognize their significance.
Or if there isn't a clear process for escalating those concerns.
So it's important to have a system for capturing those emerging risks.
Absolutely.
Okay, so both top-down and bottom-up have their strengths and weaknesses.
They do.
And ideally, you want to find a way to combine the best of both.
That's the goal, to get that balanced, comprehensive view of the risks facing the organization.
All right, now let's talk about risk assignment techniques. The article mentions the ISO IEC 31010 standard. What's that all about?
So ISO IC 31010 is an international standard that provides guidance on risk management.
Okay.
It's a really valuable resource, especially for organizations that are looking to implement or improve their risk management practices.
Sort of a best practice guide.
Exactly. And it outlines a whole toolkit of techniques that organizations can use to assess their risks.
So it's not just theory, it's practical advice on how to actually do the work.
Right, it gets into the nitty-gritty.
The article highlights a few of those techniques. Let's start with flowcharts and dependency analysis.
Okay, so these techniques involve breaking down organizational processes and operations into their individual steps, and then analyzing them to identify those critical elements that are essential for success.
Well, key dependencies.
Exactly. By understanding those key dependencies,
Hmm.
organizations can then start to think about what could potentially go wrong at each step.
What are the advantages of this approach?
Well, it can provide really valuable insights, not just for risk assessment,
Hmm.
but also for process improvement.
So it's a 2-for-1.
Yeah, you're killing two birds with one stone.
Hmm.
And the process of creating those flowcharts really forces you to develop a deep understanding of how those processes actually work.
Which can be an eye-opener in itself.
It can be, but there are also some limitations to this approach.
Okay, like what?
Well, it can be hard to apply to risks that are more strategic in nature, less process-driven.
Yeah, the big picture risks.
Right. And if you get too bogged down in the details, it can become very time-consuming.
Analysis paralysis.
Exactly.
Okay, what about questionnaires and checklists?
So questionnaires and checklists are a very common technique.
Yeah, we've all seen them in different contexts.
Exactly. And in the context of risk assessment,
Mm-hmm.
they're structured forms that are designed to gather information about potential risks in a systematic way.
So it's a way to ensure that you're considering all the key areas.
Right. You don't want to miss anything important,
And it provides a consistent format for collecting that information.
which helps to ensure some level of uniformity in the data you gather.
So you're comparing apples to apples.
Right. And they can be easily distributed across the organization.
So you can get a lot of people involved in the risk identification process.
It's a great way to get a broad perspective.
But there are limitations here too, right?
There are. One is that their structure can be a bit too rigid.
So you might miss risks that don't fit neatly into the predefined category.
Exactly. And they tend to rely on past knowledge and experience.
So you might overlook new or emerging risks.
That's a risk.
Okay, now workshops and brainstorming. That sounds a bit more dynamic.
It is. It's a much more interactive and collaborative approach.
People get in a room, throw ideas around.
Exactly. You bring together people from different parts of the organization with different perspectives, different expertise.
You brainstorm potential risks.
Right. You're looking for events that could impact the organization's objectives, its processes, its resources.
Anything that could derail the plan.
Exactly.
And the diversity of viewpoints is a big advantage here.
It is. You get a much broader range of ideas than if you were just relying on one person or a small group,
And the interactive nature of the workshop encourages discussion and debate.
which can lead to a deeper understanding of the risks.
But there are potential pitfalls here too, right?
There are. One common challenge is that senior leaders might dominate the discussion.
So the quieter voices might not get heard.
It happens. And if you don't have the right mix of people in the room,
Yeah?
you might miss important risks because the relevant expertise isn't represented.
So the composition of the group is crucial.
It is. It's all about getting the right people at the table.
All right, and finally, inspections and audits. How do those fit into risk assessment?
So inspections and audits are about verifying compliance.
Making sure everyone's following the rules.
Right. Are we adhering to established procedures, standards, regulations?
Mhm.
And they're based on tangible evidence.
You're actually looking at the physical environment, the documentation.
Exactly. So the findings tend to be very concrete.
Hard to dispute.
It's hard to argue with physical evidence,
And formal audits typically follow a very structured methodology.
which makes them very systematic and thorough.
But they have their limitations, right?
They do. They're most effective for identifying hazard risks, those physical safety risks.
Yeah, like workplace hazards.
Right. And they tend to focus on past performance.
So they might not be as good at capturing new or emerging risks.
That's true. They're looking in the rearview mirror, not necessarily at what's ahead.
Okay, so we've looked at a bunch of different risk assignment techniques.
Mm-hmm.
The article points out that checklists and questionnaires
Mm-hmm.
and brainstorming workshops are often the most commonly used methods.
They are.
But there's a trade-off between the two.
Yeah, there is.
Checklists and questionnaires are quick and easy to implement.
You can collect a lot of data quickly.
but they lack the depth and flexibility of a workshop.
That's right. You might miss those unforeseen risks, the things that aren't on the checklist.
Whereas workshops can uncover a wider range of risks through discussion.
But they take more time and require careful facilitation.
So it's a balancing act, choosing the right tool for the job.
It is. And the article also mentions identifying key dependencies as a way to focus risk assessment efforts.
So instead of brainstorming every possible risk, you start by identifying the things that are absolutely essential for success.
Precisely, those key dependencies, the things that if they fail,
A whole plan falls apart.
exactly. And once you've identified those key dependencies, you can then systematically consider the threats, the uncertainties, the opportunities that could affect each one.
It's a more targeted approach.
It is. And the article notes that in some industries, especially finance, it's crucial to quantify risk exposure.
Yeah, put a number on it.
So you need to choose risk assessment methods that can support that kind of quantitative analysis.
Right. You need data, you need numbers.
And we've talked about structured brainstorming techniques like SWOT and PESTLE.
Yeah, these are frameworks that provide a more organized approach to brainstorming.
So it's not just a free-for-all.
Right, there's a structure, a process to follow.
SWOT looks at strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, right?
That's right. It's a great tool for strategic decision-making, considering both the positives and the negatives,
But it's very broad. It doesn't have very specific risk categories.
which means you might miss some risks.
Whereas PESTLE provides a framework for analyzing the external environment.
Right, the political, economic, social, technological, legal, and environmental factors that could impact the organization.
So PESTLE is all about the external factors.
It is. Think of it as your external environment checklist. And for organizations that need a very precise measurement of risk likelihood, there are quantitative techniques like HAZOP and FMEA.
Yeah, those are much more rigorous and detailed approaches.
These are for the serious risk assessors.
They are. They involve systematically identifying potential hazards and failure modes in complex systems, and then assessing their likelihood and potential consequences in a very structured way.
So it's a deep dive.
It is, and it often requires a lot of input from subject matter experts.
People who really know their stuff.
Exactly. And it can be quite time-consuming to conduct.
Not a quick and easy process.
No, but it's very valuable for industries where the potential consequences of failure are very high.
So things like manufacturing, chemical plants, nuclear facilities.
Anywhere where safety is absolutely paramount.
Okay, we've covered a lot of different risk assignment techniques. Now let's talk about the risk matrix.
The risk matrix, yeah, it's a really fundamental tool in risk
It's
assessment.
the lack.
It is. It's a way to visually represent the relationship between the likelihood of a risk happening and the potential impact if it does happen.
So it's a grid, a two-dimensional grid.
Right. One axis is likelihood, the other axis is impact.
And you take each risk you've identified
Uh-huh.
and you plot it on the grid.
Exactly. And the position of that risk on the grid tells you a lot about its significance.
So a risk that's high likelihood and high impact,
That's going to be in the top right corner.
the danger zone.
Exactly. And a risk that's low likelihood and low impact.
That's going to be down in the bottom left corner.
Right. Not so much of a concern.
And the article provides some example criteria for likelihood and impact,
Yeah, it does.
ranging from unlikely to almost certain for likelihood
Mm-hmm.
and from small to catastrophic for impact.
Right. So for likelihood, unlikely means that the event is not expected to occur under normal circumstances.
It's possible, but not probable.
Right. Maybe it happens a couple of times in a decade. Possible means that it could happen. Or maybe it's happened infrequently in the past.
Okay.
Likely means that it's probable to occur.
It's more likely than not.
Exactly. And almost certain means that you can pretty much count on it happening.
So it's almost guaranteed.
Right.
And on the impact side, small means a minor disruption, not a big deal.
Easy to recover from.
Moderate impact is more significant,
It might take some time and resources to get back on track.
but it's manageable.
Right. Severe impact is a major disruption.
This is where things start to get serious.
It is. It could take a lot of time and money to recover.
And catastrophic is the worst case scenario.
The big one.
The organization might not survive.
That's right. It's the existential threat.
And the article mentions risk levels: low, moderate, high, critical, extreme. What do those mean in terms of action?
So a low risk might just require monitoring.
You keep an eye on it, but don't necessarily take any action.
Right. Moderate risk usually warrants some attention, maybe implementing some controls to reduce the likelihood or the impact. High risk is where you really need to start taking action.
Active management mitigation strategies.
Exactly. You need a plan to address this risk.
Critical risk is even more urgent.
You need to take immediate action to get this under control.
This is a fire alarm situation.
It is. And extreme risk, well, that's the highest priority.
All hands on deck.
You need all hands on deck, senior management involvement.
To prevent a disaster.
Exactly.
And the article stresses the need to rate risks and improve controls in a cost-effective way.
Right. You can't eliminate every risk. It's just not practical.
You have to prioritize.
You have to focus on the risks that matter most, the ones that could really hurt the organization.
The ones with the biggest potential impact.
Exactly. And it's important to be consistent in how you define likelihood and impact across the organization.
Everyone needs to be speaking the same language.
Right. If different departments are using different definitions,
Uh-huh.
the risk matrix isn't going to be very useful.
It'll be apples and oranges.
Exactly. The article suggests using at least 4 clear options for both likelihood and impact.
To avoid that tendency for people to choose the middle ground.
Right. You want to force them to make a decision. Is this risk high or low?
No fence sitters allowed.
Exactly.
So the risk matrix is a visual tool. It maps out the likelihood-impact relationship.
Right.
And it can even show where there's potential for further control.
And the difference between the current risk level and the desired target level.
So you can see how much work you need to do to get the risk down to an acceptable level.
Exactly. It's a roadmap for risk management.
And these identified risks need to be compared against the company's risk tolerance.
Right. How much risk is the organization willing to accept?
That's a key question.
It is.
Yeah.
And it involves both risk analysis, which is rating the risks,
Mm-hmm.
and risk evaluation, which is ranking them based on their importance.
So you're putting them in order.
Exactly. Which ones are the most urgent? Which ones can wait?
And the article lists several criteria for identifying key risks.
Right. Things like severity, the size of the potential impact,
Likelihood above a certain threshold.
and opportunities for improvement.
So if there's a lot of room for improvement,
Mm-hmm.
that risk might get bumped up the priority list.
It might. Because it means you have a good chance of reducing that risk.
By implementing better controls.
Exactly.
And the ISO 31000 standard uses the term level of risk,
Yeah.
which is based on this combination of likelihood and impact.
Sometimes called risk severity.
Right, so it's all about assessing the overall level of risk based on how likely it is to happen.
And how bad it would be if it did happen.
And the article stresses the need for clear definitions of these terms.
Yeah, everyone needs to be on the same page.
So the risk matrix is being applied consistently across the organization.
Absolutely.
Now let's talk about those situations where you have different opinions on a risk in a workshop setting.
Ah, yes, the clash of perspectives.
How do you handle those disagreements?
Well, one way is to use voting software.
To get a sense of the average opinion.
And the range of views, how much disagreement there is.
But the article emphasizes that discussion is even more important.
It is, because simply voting doesn't resolve the underlying disagreement.
You need to talk it through.
You need to understand why people are seeing the risk differently.
Explore the different assumptions.
And the evidence that's supporting those different views.
And hopefully, through that discussion, you can arrive at a more shared understanding.
Which then makes it easier to agree on the right control measures.
Makes sense. And the article lists a bunch of factors that can influence risk perception.
Yeah, it's a long list.
Whether the risk is voluntary or involuntary.
Mhm.
Whether it has an unfair impact on certain groups.
Whether we think we can personally control it.